Hi, you guys. What's up? See you guys. Hope everything's going good. Feeling good. Made it to the weekend. Had a good week. Want to look at an article that was really a big eye opener for me a couple years ago. I was looking at this question because I was thinking, what am I going to do? What does God want me to do? Given that my wife and I are broken up, and a lot of people are out there telling me to remarry, and don't wait around, and a lot of fish in the sea, and yada yada yada. You guys know the drill. So I started looking around. I started reading articles, and I came across this one. I wanted to do a remake because one, I had read on some Facebook groups where there's a particular comment I saw from somebody, I think truly questioning, what should I do? Should I divorce my husband? There had been some sexting with somebody else. I think there was a previous affair, something like that. I don't know what was going on her end. And I really don't know much about the couple, but I felt like it was someone who really was questioning what should they do before the Lord. Maybe they were Christian, maybe they weren't, I'm not sure, but it wasn't a Christian group for marriage restorations. And so it really got me to thinking about this article, how this article was so helpful to me. And one of the things that originally led me to it was one, David Pawson, and some of his views about that I thought was quite strange. I never heard anything like him before. I just covered him initially because of the channel. Want to get exposure to all these things, and I was doing, honestly, my own research. So David had a view where he said, okay, divorce under some circumstances, yeah, okay, but no remarriage. So he basically felt like that the covenant stood for a lifetime, as long as, till death do us part, that kind of thing. And he mentioned this guy Erasmus, and I looked at Erasmus, and then I went looking for a secondary article, which led me to this. Who is this Erasmus guy? One of the questions that came up related to that was, what are we going to do with this situation where if we look at Matthew and then Mark and then Luke, we'll notice that in the Mark and the Luke Gospels, there's just a flat out, according to Jesus, no exception. If you divorce and get remarried, you're in adultery. No ifs, ands, or buts, straight up like that. You flip over a couple pages though, and if you read it in Matthew's account, all of a sudden there is this exception clause. And I thought, wow, I never realized that before. Once I did, I said, well, this is quite a conundrum. I mean, what an interesting realization, and where does that leave us? So one thing that this gentleman does, G.J. Wenham, he looks at exactly that question, and he's not the first. That's why he calls it an old Crux revisited. He calls it the Crux because I used to be into rock climbing or bouldering, and they would say in that if you're doing a bouldering route, the hardest part is the crux, the part that really matters the most. That if you can get that part, then the rest of it is kind of, fairly simple. So we're going to look at this. I hope you guys enjoy it. I'll stop blabbing. I'm also going to say goodbye. I'll close this out. And, yep, okay, enjoy. Okay, so Matthean divorce, an old Crux revisited, G.J. Wenham, College of St. Paul, and St. Mary. It says, for centuries, New Testament scholars have wrestled with Matthew's pronouncement about divorce, particularly Matthew 19:9. Whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity, in the Greek porneia, and marries another commits adultery. Now, since the year 1519, when Erasmus first promulgated this view in the West, the majority of Protestant exegetes have understood this verse to allow divorce and remarriage by the innocent party in cases of unchastity, usually understood to be adultery. On the other hand, the early church fathers, with one minor exception, held that Matthew 19:9 legitimated separation for adultery, but not remarriage, a view still widely maintained by Roman Catholic writers. Now, with the rise of critical studies of the Gospels in the 19th century, problems with the Erasmian view began to show up, and new interpretations of the crucial acceptive clause have become popular. In particular, source and redaction criticism have made it difficult to interpret Matthew 19:9 in a simple Erasmian sense, yet the newer views have thrown up fresh difficulties of their own. My purpose is to review the main exegetical options that have been advocated recently and then suggest a new approach to understanding the acceptive clause, essentially a modified patristic view that I think avoids the problems inherent in other views. Now, the first problem to which early source critics drew attention was the contradiction between an Erasmian interpretation of Matthew 19:9 and Jesus' teaching on divorce in other sources. In Mark, Q and Paul's account of Jesus' teaching, reference 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 through 11, also Romans 7, verse 3, there is no hint of Matthew's acceptive clause. Jesus appears to rule out divorce completely. In Mark's account, Jesus' debate with the Pharisees over divorce in Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 9, Jesus rejects Deuteronomy's legislation on divorce and concludes his public utterance with the words, quote, what therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder, end quote. Now, to this, Mark appends Jesus' private teachings to the disciples. You can see that in Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, which closely parallels Luke 16, verse 18, and less closely Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, and Matthew 19:9. Now, the Lucan form of the saying, which goes, quote, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery, end quote, is generally acknowledged to be the most demonstrably authentic form of Jesus' teaching, passing the stringent form-critical dissimilarity test easily. It is at once perfectly at home in Palestinian Judaism, in that it envisages only a man initiating divorce, and yet is strikingly original in its form. The saying is original in three ways. First, it denies that divorce proceedings really secure freedom from marriage. To remarry after divorce is to commit adultery. Yet, according to the Mishnah, the essence of a bill of divorce was the formula, thou art free to marry any man. And that's taken from the Gittin 9.3. Now, the woman was given a bill of divorce precisely so that she would not be accused of adultery if she lived with another man. But by this saying, Jesus states that despite the divorce, the marriage bond still exists. That is why remarriage is adulterous. Second, and this is even clearer in Mark chapter 10, verse 11, note the added phrase, quote unquote, against her. Jesus redefines adultery. Under Old Testament and classical law, a married man was not adulterous if he had sexual relationships with an unmarried woman. A married woman, on the other hand, was always guilty of adultery if she had intercourse with anyone except her husband. Now, according to Jesus, a man must be as loyal to his wife as she must be to him. If divorce, which is supposed to secure the right of remarriage, followed by remarriage is adultery, it follows that a second union without the legal form of divorce must be adulterous too. This saying then puts man and wife on equal footing as regards to conjugal rights. Both must be exclusively loyal to each other. Infidelity by either is adultery, not just infidelity by the wife. Thirdly, the statement rules out polygamy approved by the Pharisees, practiced by the Western Jews until the year 1030 under Rabbi Gershom's decree, and also the Yemenite Jews until the year 1948. The demand for monogamy is a corollary of the second point. If a man takes a second wife, having divorced his first wife, he commits adultery against his first wife. It must therefore be just as much adultery to remarry without a divorce, a ceremony supposedly entitling one to remarry. Now, this saying is very original, indeed revolutionary, when set against its Jewish background. By declaring remarriage after divorce adulterous, it rules out real divorce, polygamy, and male infidelity. According then to the most primitive sayings, Jesus taught that divorce was against God's will, and indeed that the legal ceremony did not secure its goal of allowing both parties to remarry. A divorcee was not free to remarry, for that would be to commit adultery. The Markan, Lucan, and Pauline versions of the Dominical teaching apparently admit of no exception. What then is to be made of the Matthean exception clause? Is this a real exception allowing remarriage in certain cases, as Erasmus supposed? Till recently, this has been the most common view in critical Protestant scholarship. Matthew has modified Jesus' harsh teaching. He wanted to maintain the spirit of Christ's attitude, but be realistic in applying it to the needs of his church. The acceptive clause is best understood as Matthew's addition to the Dominical teaching. Matthew 19 is then read on two levels. The first, A, what Jesus himself taught, viz. The indissolubility of marriage with no right of divorce, and B, the ideal of lifelong marriage, but with divorce and remarriage permitted for unchastity. However, this two-level understanding of Matthew 19 creates its own problems. Would the evangelist have felt free to modify Jesus' teaching so drastically? And more importantly, it creates great difficulty at the second level, that of Matthew's view of divorce, as opposed to Jesus' original teaching. Tradition critics point out that if we suppose Matthew took over Mark's account of Jesus' dispute with the Pharisees, Matthew has so modified Jesus' teaching as to make nonsense of it. At least if we take 19:9 to allow divorce and remarriage for unchastity. This is the more strange since Matthew is much more precise than Mark in setting the discussion in the context of first century Judaism. Okay, so Matthew 19:3 begins by Jesus being asked for his opinion on one of the outstanding issues between the Pharisaic parties of the day. What reasons justify divorce? The liberal Hillelites permitted divorce for almost any reason, even bad cooking. The conservative Shammite Pharisees restricted divorce to serious sexual misconduct. Now, Jesus apparently rejects all divorce, like the Damascus Rule, CD 14:19 through 5.3. He quotes Genesis chapter 1, verse 17, as well as chapter 2, verse 24, as proof that God created man and wife to be lifelong partners. You can see that in verses 4 through 6. So the Pharisees naturally refer to Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, which at least authorizes divorce for some indecency, quote unquote, some indecency, according to the RSV. But Jesus again rejects divorce. It merely demonstrated Israel's hardness of heart. Quote, from the beginning it was not so, he says in verse 8. In other words, neither the liberal Hillelites nor the strict Shammites are right to argue the legitimacy of divorce on the basis of Deuteronomy 24. Then suddenly, if the Erasmian remarriage view is right, Jesus backtracks. He allows divorce and remarriage for unchastity, a view quite acceptable to the Shammites at least. It is to say the least most inept editing to have Jesus contradict himself in succeeding sentences. He damns the Shammites in verse 8 for their exegesis of Deuteronomy and then agrees with them in verse 9. But in reality, of course, it is Matthew who is to blame for this confusion, and the commenters vie with one another in heaping opprobrium on Matthew for the confusions he introduced. Quote, the whole section suffers from inconsistency of thought due to the literary revision and compilation. Quote, at this point, tensions within Matthew's account become extremely acute. His additions are, quote, confused and confusing, is what some have said. It is the assumption of these commentators that Matthew 19:9 is to be understood in an Erasmian sense that lies behind their derogatory remarks. If Matthew 19:9 is not endorsing the Shammite/Erasmian view that divorce followed by remarriage is permissible for unchastity, the evangelist may not have been so confused as some of his modern interpreters suggest. Redaction criticism, too, has highlighted the problem of understanding Matthew 19:9 in an Erasmian sense. Focus on the evangelist's editorial methods. Redaction critics have become very sensitive to the relationship between different units of tradition. They insist that sayings of Jesus cannot be interpreted in isolation from each other, as earlier Reform critics tended to suppose, but that the evangelist has linked sayings together deliberately to shed light on them. So Matthew 19:9, introduced by the phrase, "and I say to you," quote unquote, "and I say to you," shows that the evangelist understood Jesus to be deliberately and authoritatively rejecting contemporary Jewish views of divorce, including presumably the Shammite view. Cross-reference the repeated use of the phrase in Matthew chapter 5:22, verse 28, verse 32, verse 34, verse 39, as well as verse 44. Yet severe problems are posed by Matthew 19 in verses 10 through 12. The pericope about eunuchs, which immediately follows the discussion about divorce in Matthew 19, verses 3 through 9. Now, as additionally understood, Matthew 19, 10 through 12 deals with those who remain celibate in pursuit of the kingdom. However, this sits very oddly after the discussion of marriage in Matthew 19, 3 through 9. Quote, "The whole thrust of the passage has been toward building up the greatness and sanctity before God of monogamous marriage." Then, in verse 10, the disciples reject this picture of life utterly. And then, if verse 11 and 12 do not refer to a call of celibacy, Matthew's whole line of thought suddenly shifts. Suddenly, Jesus agrees with the disciples' objection and begins to teach that indeed it is not advantageous to marry. It is a good thing to give up marriage altogether for the kingdom of heaven. Furthermore, the disciples' objection in verse 10, quote, "If such is the case of a man and his wife, it is not expedient to marry," end quote, shows that verse 10 through 12 are a continuation of the discussion on marriage in verses 3 through 9. Yet it is quite anomalous for Jesus to endorse his disciples' objections as the celibacy view maintains. The regular function of the disciples' speeches in the Gospels is to raise objection to our Lord's teaching, which he then dispatches with a final clinching remark, as here in verse 12. So cross-reference 19, verses 13 through 14, 22 through 26, as well as chapter 8, verse 19, 21, and then chapter 14, 26, as well as 14:30, and also chapter 15, verse 12, etc. So here the disciples' objection is apparently answered by Jesus' saying that indeed some men are called to be eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. But if these eunuchs are those who embrace celibacy to follow Jesus, Jesus is apparently endorsing the disciples' standpoint. They say, quote, "It's better not to marry," end quote. And he replies in effect, quote, "Yes, that is true in some cases," end quote. Such a concession to the disciples' objection is quite without parallel in the gospel. However, if we take the quote, "the eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom," end quote, as divorcees who do not remarry out of loyalty to Christ, verse 12, that quote, he who is able to receive this, let him receive it, cross-reference chapter 13, verse 9, makes a strong challenging conclusion to the discussion on divorce and remarriage. Despite the disciples' qualms, Jesus reasserts his final position quite undiluted. Finally, it's very difficult to see the connection between verse 9 and 10 on an Erasmian interpretation of Matthew 19:9. Why should the disciples have been so shocked by Jesus' teaching if verse 9 allows for remarriage after divorce for unchastity? This was not a novel position. The Shammites held it. Nor is it so onerous a view as to make marriage undesirable. No doubt a man of a Shammite principle would not lightly enter into matrimony, but he did have a way out if his wife misbehaved. However, If verse 9 is not allowing an innocent divorcee to remarry, we can fully share the disciples' shock and outrage. If this is how it is between a man and his wife, it's better not to marry. That's what they said in verse 10. The context of verse 9, therefore, makes an Erasmus remarriage interpretation very implausible. On the one hand, it makes Jesus agree with the Shamites, whom he has just condemned in verse 8, and on the other hand, it fails to explain the strength of the disciples' reaction in verse 10. And no remarriage interpretation of verse 9 would avoid this problem. Alternatively, an interpretation of unchastity, or porneia, much narrower than the Shamite view, would also eliminate it. It is the latter opinion that is adopted by many modern writers. If porneia, or unchastity, is a precise, narrow term for a relatively rare offense, it would be possible to see how Jesus is being portrayed as much stricter than the Shamite Pharisees and why the disciples were so surprised. Now in 1 Corinthians 5:1, at least, porneia describes an incestuous union, and it is frequently argued that porneia has the same narrow meaning, that is, incest, in Matthew 19:9 and in Matthew 5:32. It is suggested that Matthew, by including a reference to incest, was coping with a particular problem for his community. Jews would have taken for granted the incest regulations of Leviticus chapter 18 and Leviticus chapter 20, prohibiting certain unions, and Jesus did not have to mention them. However, among the Gentile converts for whom Matthew was writing, there were those who had contracted incestuous unions before conversion. Matthew's exception clause stated that these marriages, quote-unquote marriages, were null and void. He was not dealing with reasons for ordinary divorce, but with grounds for nullity, a much narrower basis than Shammai allowed. This interpretation, unlike the Erasmus one, makes for a clear and logical development of thought in Matthew 19:3-9, and minimizes the difference between the evangelist views and those of Jesus himself. A similar approach is adopted by Isaacson, who likewise looks for a very narrow, though quite different understanding of porneia. He argues it means unfaithfulness during the betrothal period. Though such explanations of unchastity do justice to Matthew's editorial skills and do not make him the naive fool postulated on the Erasmus remarriage view, they hardly do justice to the obvious meaning of porneia: prostitution, unchastity, fornication, of every kind of unlawful sexual intercourse. In other words, porneia is a broad umbrella term covering a wide variety of sexual offenses, including incest, adultery, fornication, and so on. It is therefore most peculiar to have it used without further definition in such a narrow sense, as the Matthean context requires. If only incest or adultery were meant by porneia, one would have expected a different term to be used or the word to be qualified in some way. Given the context of Matthew 19:9, a legal debate with the Pharisees, it seems likely that porneia refers to, quote, some indecency of Deuteronomy 24:1, which even on the Shamite view covers a variety of sexual offenses. Undoubtedly, the slickest way of dealing with the acceptive clause is the so-called preteritive view, advocated by a long line of authors. This understands except for unchastity as a mere aside. On this view, Matthew 19:9 may be translated as follows: whoever divorces his wife, unchastity is irrelevant, and marries another, commits adultery. In other words, the phrase does not materially alter the sense of the clause. It is simply a passing rejection of the Shamite claim that divorce is justified for porneia. On this understanding of Matthew 19:9, Jesus is just as firm as he is in Mark 10, verse 11, or in Luke 16, verse 18. There is no scope for real divorce with the right to remarry. This makes excellent sense in the context. Matthew 19:8 implicitly rejects the Shamite position. Verse 9 does so explicitly, and then verse 10, the disciples loudly protest. Finally, in verse 12, Jesus reasserts his position that some must remain eunuchs after divorce, quote, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, end quote. The preteritive position just outlined is probably defensible in Matthew 5:32, but grammatically it's very strained in Matthew 19:9. As Dupont has pointed out, the phrase "except for in chastity" in Matthew 19:9 is elliptical for a conditional clause. Were Matthew more long-winded, he would have said, "Whoever divorces his wife, if it is not for unchastity that he divorces her and marries another, commits adultery." So all the views so far outlined have their problems. The Erasmian view clashes with its context. The rabbinic incest and betrothal interpretations give an unusually restricted sense of porneia, while the preteritive view forces Greek grammar. The patristic view that allows separation but not remarriage for porneia escapes these problems. As this was the view of all early Greek writers who taught and wrote in their mother tongue with an ease and fluency no modern scholar can achieve, it does have an intrinsic probability other recent views lack. In fact, early Christian writers held that the acceptive clause did not simply legitimate separation for porneia, it required it. It seems most likely that this arose out of a comparison with Paul's teaching that union with a prostitute is incompatible with union with Christ. You can see that 1 Corinthians 6, verses 15 and 16. Therefore, separation from an unchaste partner was not merely permissible, but mandatory for a Christian. Modern advocates of the patristic view, however, regard the acceptive clause as merely permissive, not directive. Now, although the modified patristic view escapes all the contextual and linguistic problems associated with the other views, the Erasmian tradition is so entrenched that it has become difficult to take the patristic view seriously. The one great problem with the patristic view is that at first sight it seems that the acceptive clause must cover both divorce and remarriage. For if it is legitimate to divorce for porneia, then surely remarriage afterwards cannot be regarded as adultery. The key question in Matthew 19:9, 5:23 poses no problem for the patristic interpretation, is, does the acceptive clause cover only divorce or divorce and remarriage? Did Matthew mean A, that divorce and remarriage except for unchastity is adultery? Or was he asserting two propositions in a single sentence? That is, B, part 1, divorce except for unchastity is adultery, and B, part 2, divorce and remarriage is always adultery. So A, as you can see on the screen, A is the Erasmian Shammite view. And B is the modified patristic view. Dupont has masterly studied marriage et divorce dans l'Evangile, 1959. Has discussed these issues with greater clarity and incisiveness than any other modern writer. He points out that if the acceptive clause came later in the sentence, after, quote, and marries another, the only correct understanding would be A, which permits remarriage after divorce. However, the present position of the acceptive clause makes either view, A or B, possible. He suggests that Matthew's special Jewish interests have led him to insert this clause. The problems with the alternative views already outlined led Dupont to advocate the modified patristic view. In other words, he offers a defense for this view by demonstrating the weakness of others. To one like myself, brought up in the Erasmian tradition, Dupont's work lacks one thing: an adequate and convincing explanation of why Matthew inserted his acceptive clause. This essay will close by offering a suggestion. It says, To understand how Matthew constructed 19:9, it is necessary to bear in mind his methods of working attested elsewhere in the gospel. We've already noted the importance of the principles in the interpretation of Matthew 19, verses 10 through 12, where the disciples' objection and Jesus' reply conform to typical patterns in the gospel. In verse 9, the use of the standard redactional formula, "and I say to you," has also been noted. But two other forms of Matthew's technique must also be borne in mind here. First, Matthew is fond of repetition. He likes to repeat key sayings of Jesus. By this means, he not only underlines their importance, but allows the context of the saying in one place to shed light on its meaning in another. Second, Matthew tends to abbreviate material that is given more fully either in his gospel or elsewhere in the synoptic tradition. Both these techniques, duplication and abbreviation, are evident in his handling of the divorce logia. First, it should be noted that this characteristic of Matthew to duplicate sayings, sometimes in slightly different forms in different parts of the gospel. For example, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, is seen in many places. Obviously, the divorce logia falls into the same pattern, and particularly the accepted clauses in Matthew 5:32, 19:9. It is therefore necessary to interpret the one saying in light of the other. Presumably, the evangelist expects the reader to recall the first when he meets the second. To understand Matthew 19:9, it is therefore necessary to recall Jesus' remarks about divorce and adultery in the Sermon on the Mount. Here, the divorce saying in Matthew 5:32, "Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery," is one of the 6 antitheses found in Matthew 5:21 through 48, in which Jesus contrasts his teaching with what was said to the men of old. However, the second and third antitheses are both on the same subject, Jesus' new definition of adultery. The second antithesis states that lust is quote-unquote adultery in the heart. And the third, the antithesis, is really a supplement to the second, giving a new definition of adultery, extending it to include remarriage after divorce. More precisely, the third antithesis states, 1. Divorce a woman except for unchastity, and 2. Remarrying a divorced woman count as adultery. Acts which no contemporary Jew so regarded. In fact, 532a, quote, "Everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, makes her an adulteress," focuses on the woman's plight, but puts the blame for her sin on her husband. By divorcing her, he forces her to seek another husband and thereby commit adultery. Jesus blames the first husband for the woman's adultery. He could just as well have said, "Anyone who divorces his wife, except for unchastity, commits adultery." Now, in 532a, it is clear the acceptive clause excuses the husband from blame for divorcing his unchaste wife. It says nothing about the propriety of remarrying after divorce. This is dealt with in Matthew 5:32b, which says, quote, "Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery," end quote. This, as often noted, is virtually identical with Luke. The common synoptic view is that divorce followed by remarriage is adultery. Matthew 5:32a is thus adding a new idea that divorce by itself is also adultery, unless it be for unchastity. In that case, divorce does not count as adulterous. There would be no point in adding the acceptive clause to exonerate an unchaste wife. Most commonly, she would already committed adultery before her divorce. That is why her husband wanted to divorce her. His actions in divorcing her cannot therefore be said to cause her to commit adultery. The acceptive clause is excusing the husband from the charge of adultery, not explaining his action in divorcing her. Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5:32 therefore can be summed up in 3 propositions. Proposition number 1, divorce and remarriage is adultery, seen in chapter 5, verse 32b. Proposition number 2, divorce by itself is adultery by the husband, see the context, except in the case of unchastity. You can see that in verse 32a of Matthew chapter 5. Proposition number 3, divorce by itself leads to adultery by the wife when she remarries. And that's, again, Matthew 5:32a. So the second proposition is unique to Matthew. The other 2 remarks are closely paralleled in Luke and Mark. Second, it is characteristic of Matthew to abridge material found more fully elsewhere in the synoptic tradition. This is most evident in his narratives, where he often presupposes details found in other Gospels. But he also tends to abridge the sayings of Jesus. For example, where Mark 9:43-47 recommends cutting off hand, foot, or eye to avoid sin, Matthew in 5:29-30 reduces it to plucking out the eye or cutting off the hand. Matthew 10:37 gives a briefer list of relations than Luke chapter 14, verse 26. Also, Matthew chapter 22, verse 5 omits the excuse of marrying a wife mentioned in Luke 14:18-20. And Matthew's account of the dispute with the Sadducees about the resurrection is noticeably more succinct than the parallels in Mark and Luke. It'd be Mark chapter 12, Luke chapter 20. Now, if Matthew was summing up Jesus' teaching on divorce in Matthew 19 as an introductory formula, and I say unto you, leads us to expect concise, epigrammatic brevity might be anticipated. A terse and forceful summary of teaching found elsewhere in the Gospels would be characteristic of his style. This is what appears to be the case. So Luke chapter 16, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Matthew could be cast in a similar form. Everyone who divorces his wife, except for unchastity, commits adultery. Adding Luke 16:18 and Matthew 5:32a and abbreviating in Matthean fashion, we arrive, everyone who divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another commits adultery, which is identical with Matthew 19:9 in content, though slightly different syntactically. In other words, the grammatical structure and semantic content of Matthew 19:9 are perfectly intelligible when the verse is analyzed into its constituent components. It affirms, 1, that divorce followed by remarriage is always adulterous, the point made by all the synoptic Gospels. And point 2, that divorce by itself, except for unchastity, is also adulterous, which is Matthew's own view. Matthew 19:9 is thus a concise abridgment of principles enunciated more fully in chapter 5, verse 32, and Luke 16:18. This interpretation of the exception clause sees them fit as freeing some divorces of the charge of being adulterous. They do not exempt any remarriages after divorce from this accusation. Interpreted this way, Matthew 19:9 is indeed a powerful climax to the debate with the Pharisees, with Jesus surpassing the strictness of the Shamites and shocking the disciples. Furthermore, this interpretation absolves the evangelist Matthew from the charge of poor editorial work and toning down the unpalatable teaching of Jesus. If anything, he might be regarded as more severe than the other synoptists, for only he preserves the idea that divorce by itself may be adulterous. The exegesis of Matthew 19:3-12 is a teasingly difficult jigsaw puzzle. Every solution proposed hitherto has proposed some difficulty or other. Some piece just does not seem to fit. The Erasmian interpretation of verse 9 clashes with its immediate context. The rabbinic and betrothal views demand an unnaturally narrow meaning for the word porneia, while the preteritive view is syntactically difficult. However, the modified patristic view advocated here avoids these problems. if Matthew 19:9 is seen as affirming that any remarriage after divorce is adultery, and that divorce alone except for unchastity is also adulterous, this saying makes good sense in context and avoids charging the evangelist with lexical and grammatical impropriety. From a pastoral point of view, this is probably the hardest option for our age to accept. We may well exclaim with the disciples, if this is the case, it's better not to marry. But that is another problem. Our purpose has been to understand the mind of Matthew more clearly, and behind that, the teaching of our Lord. Whew. You can see the notes if you're interested. You want to do more research. I know it is quite a lot. It's fairly technical. Definitely makes you wrinkle your brow a little bit and scratch your brain and maybe write some stuff down and make sure that you got it right, that it makes sense. The different points, the different parts. There's some strange words, the preteritive view, the patristic view, modified patristic view. Maybe you've never heard of Erasmus or the Shamites or the Hillelites. And you're a good Bible reader, but some of this history stuff and all these technical things by DuPont and these other folks is all new. And I get it. It was totally new to me. And I said, wow, what is all this? And I had to really look at it and think about it and think it through. But at the end of the day, I think it's really, really helpful. I know that God has given us the ability to think critically, to understand language, to understand words, to look at this. And my opinion is that maybe 5, at most 10% of the difficulty in approaching papers like this is the mental aspect of it, the rigor that it brings to the mind, the logic behind the words, breaking everything down. And a much larger percent, 95% I would say, is the emotional difficulty of, God, is this really from your Spirit? God, if this is really from your Spirit, are you kidding? Are you kidding me? I really have to walk this road out, God? I wasn't ready for this. This is hard. This is going to be difficult. Is this what it means, God? Is this the path that you laid out for me to understand who you are and what you're like, what you call people to, and how you would act when you were married, as you are married, as you're married to the church, as you've been in covenants with people before? Is this how you want me to live? Is this what you want me to do? Hey, I hope you guys like it, and we will talk to you next time. All the best. God, please help us on our journey. Amen.